Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. Today we get to speak with NICOLE Gelinas. She's an expert on urban planning and New York City in general. We're going to talk about congestion pricing, which 2 minutes after we finished recording, Trump pulled the approval for it from the Department of Transportation. So stay tuned on that. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more going on that front. That said, this podcast is pretty informative about not only where New York City came from in terms of its transportation policy, but where it's going and a lot of the pluses and minuses around congestion pricing. Very much well worth the listen, as is Nicole's book, which is called Movement, and it's also out on Amazon. Nicole, welcome aboard.
Good morning, Fraser. Thanks for having me on.
So how did you get interested in congestion pricing and New York City transport? It sounds like a beautiful mess to try to unwind.
Well, when I first moved to New York City, I lived in a neighborhood called Gravesend. I lived on Ocean Parkway and Avenue X out in Brooklyn, and beautiful neighborhood close to Coney Island Beach. But drawback is that it is very far away from Lower and Midtown Manhattan. So my commute on the subway on the F train could be anywhere from 50 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes one way, depending on how the trains are working. And that gave me a lot of time to think about, does the commute need to be this long? Why doesn't the MTA have express tracks on this route? And that sent me into delving into the MTA budget, started to see all of these inefficiencies in the MTA budget. And so all I wanted, very naive about New York State and city politics at the time, was to write a couple of articles and say, if you save money on this, this, and this, you could build express tracks and give people a better commute. Ironically, they actually did eventually open up the express tracks on that line long after I had moved to Manhattan. But that got me interested in transit and transit politics and transportation in general. And I realized this is not just about my commute. Everybody, most of us don't deal with the government a lot in our day-to-day business. I mean, maybe if we have kids in the public schools, the garbage gets picked up. You don't really notice that. Hopefully, you're not dealing with the police and the fire and the corrections department. So transportation is, in our daily commute, is the only time that we're regularly in contact with the government and the government really impacting the quality of our life. I mean, this is, 2 hours a day for a lot of people. So if you're not happy in your commute, you're not happy with a lot of things. And how do we get this right and wrong in New York State and city just seemed like a very interesting topic and has been for quite a long time for me.
Well, it's one of those things where I worked for the Department of Economic Development before I went to law school, that the commute is a big deal and either a driver or a massive detractor from economic development. Did you see anything along those lines? The book is wonderful in the sense that you go backward and really trace the history of these things. How did that development impact the way you thought about this?
Yes. So the commute is the commute lines are development lines. So when New York City built its first subway line, opened up in 1904 from City Hall up to Upper Manhattan. I mean, this was both the effect of people moving further uptown in Manhattan and commuting downtown, and also the cause. I mean, that subway and the other subways that we built over the next 30 years, this spurred development first of apartment buildings. So all of the apartment buildings on Central Park West, Grand Concourse in the Bronx. I mean, this was dense building alongside a heavy rail line and bringing people to dense areas of employment. So when people talk about building housing, what they really mean, at least if they're doing it right, is building transit. And we stopped doing that after the 1930s. So we built out a lot of neighborhoods, including South Brooklyn, Eastern Queens, all of Staten Island, without adequate transit. We stopped building subway lines and the commuter rail lines. And we said, well, people can drive to these neighborhoods. We'll build new parkways, new expressways, and they can have a driving commute. It's a lot cheaper to build a highway or a road than to build and operate a transit line. And there's nothing wrong with people wanting to live a suburban lifestyle. I mean, the good thing about the country and the city is there are many options for, if you want to have a yard, terrific. If you want to be closer to the bright lights of the city and have a smaller apartment, that's fine too. But the problem with that, not building any more subways and relying on road construction, actually comes up with congestion pricing, because you have people who live in parts of New York City, very long commutes, and these are the people saying, well, you never built me a subway line, you never built me a commuter rail line, but you still expect me to come to Manhattan, but now I'm going to have to pay to drive to Manhattan.
Again, it's a topic that's generated a lot of heat. As we get into the book a little bit, you talk about some tragedies and some near misses that occurred in the development of the city. The tragedies being maybe the Cross Bronx Expressway, or the death of the streetcar, and then near misses being maybe a road cutting straight through Washington Square Park, maybe the demolishment of Grand Central Terminal, that type of thing. What did you find with that as it related to the history of New York City's development?
Well, I think there's one thing that's grown up as a myth that is really not correct. And the reason that it matters is not to sort of go back furiously rewriting history, but because it has implications for how we deal with things today. So, this idea that Robert Moses was the big villain and he foisted these expressways and parkways and other limited access highways onto New York City and state without the state and city wanting those things, that he kind of tricked elected officials into doing these things, that's just not correct. I mean, the blueprint for the city's network work of expressways, parkways, highways, this was put together by a group of prominent citizens through the 1920s, called the Regional Plan. Moses had nothing to do with that. He was only building his reputation during this era. He was working on his first project, Southern State Parkway and Jones Beach. He wasn't sort of this eminent wise man that people would say, oh, yes, Moses says from on high, we want to build highways. They came up with this on their own. Their reasoning, if you follow it, was sound for the time, that people wanted to be in private motor vehicles. This was convenient. If the city did not redesign itself around a private motor vehicle, the city would lose these people and lose this economic activity to the suburbs. So Moses was more, he took that plan and he enthusiastically and competently began to build it out. But if someone named Robert Moses had never been born, it is quite likely we would have come up with the same blueprint for New York City road development. And the other side of that myth was that one person named Jane Jacobs really stopped all this, is beginning in the 1960s. This was the showdown between Moses and Jacobs in Greenwich Village over Lower Manhattan Expressway. Again, Jane Jacobs, a very important person, had a lot of contributions to society, just like Moses, but this was a broad movement that it became very clear starting in the late 50s that building limited access multi-lane expressways and parkways through dense cities was not a good idea, and it was a large coalition of people who stopped this. So it's kind of, what is the lesson for today? This is never about one person on either side. This is about building broad, effective political coalitions to move elected officials. And my book has many examples of how to do that. So even if, some of your listeners/viewers, they don't care about transportation, don't think any of this is interesting, fine. But if they have some political cause that they are interested in, many of the examples in here throughout history show you how to get that political cause enacted in law.
Cool stuff. So let's dive into congestion pricing in a little more depth here. What is it trying to do? I mean, if you're a city resident or someone who commutes in, complaining about traffic and the time it takes to get in and the commute times is a well-worn tradition. And then, the idea that there's money that is needed to build out subways, et cetera, that makes sense too. What else is going on here?
Sure. Well, congestion pricing, I'm sure many of your fans are economists. It's not a complex economic theory that the road space, particularly in core Manhattan, Midtown, and Lower Manhattan, is scarce. We're not building any more road space. In fact, we've taken away road space for other uses. So the best way to allocate that road space is to charge for it, and people who feel that paying the charge is worth their while will pay the charge. In return, they will get a faster drive through these areas of core Manhattan. And people who don't want to pay the charge, that price reveals that it wasn't worth it to them. So they will either take transit if transit is an option for them, or they will just not come to or Midtown Manhattan. So, this has been talked about in New York City for 60 years, going back to Lindsay administration. And the other cities, of course, London, Singapore, Milan, Stockholm, have implemented some version of this. New York is kind of late to this program. So finally, we have it. We've had it for 2 months, and it's basically working as you would expect. Traffic is down. The number of vehicles coming into core Manhattan is down. The commute times are, startlingly better, anywhere from 20 to 70% on these roadways to and through core Manhattan. The issue is there are still, there's many quibbles with the details of how we've implemented this, but the broad issue is that economics can never be divorced from political, social, demographic issues. And so a lot of people who don't have transit commutes are understandably upset that they have a lot of sunk costs in where they live. They've purchased a house, suddenly they're facing hundreds of dollars extra to drive into Manhattan. And the other big issue is this money is supposed to go toward the MTA, $1 billion a year. MTA is very bad at spending money efficiently and effectively, and congestion pricing doesn't change that. It's just yet another revenue stream for them.
In my zone of relevance in Manhattan is really kind of a triangle between the Upper East Side, Gramercy, and the Port Authority building, and pretty much everywhere in between, maybe some outliers here and there. And it feels, and again, this is an anecdote, not data, it feels like traffic is better, although not great. Maybe it's gone from apocalypse to tolerable. How much of that is related to taxis, Ubers, the volume of those cars not really going down versus maybe the commute behavior being altered?
Well, that's one of the problems, is that there's a push and a pull. So you can push people onto mass transit and make it so miserable and expensive for them to drive, and make it so necessary for them to be in Manhattan because, I mean, it's not 2019 anymore. A lot of people have demonstrated that they don't need to be in Manhattan 5 days a week in order to do their jobs. And even these RTO mandates, they're not being enforced at the level that I think people outside these industries can appreciate. So there's still some flexibility in the commute. But yes, you can push people onto the transit system, or you can pull them onto the transit system, make transit so attractive and convenient that they would rather be on transit than be driving. And the pulling strategy actually worked for 3 decades. I mean, the number of private cars coming into core Manhattan actually peaked close to 30 years ago in the mid 1990s. So we had decades of growth, the growth around the dot-com bubble, around the turn of the millennium, the growth up until the 2008 financial crisis, massive population, jobs, and tourist growth without adding a single new vehicle coming in to core Manhattan. How did we do that? We made transit very attractive. Just the improve public safety on the transit system, improve reliability, better subway cars, and so forth. So if you had a choice, you would prefer to take mass transit. I mean, most people don't drive to core Manhattan for fun. So it's actually working without congestion pricing. one big reason that it stopped working was starting around 2011, you had Uber, Lyft flood core Manhattan with tens of thousands of extra for hire cars. And by design, these cars were empty most of the time. Because if you want to call up on your phone, oh, I want an Uber, Uber wants that car to be there within minutes. So you need an empty car nearby. And so that contributed and still contributes significantly to core Manhattan traffic. And the arguments that Uber and Lyft made around the time that we're helping outer borough people without transit options, blah, they do some of that. But like many businesses, most of their business was in Manhattan because that is where the money is. No different than the yellow taxis. They would rather be in Manhattan because that's where the customers are. So this was poorly regulated and added significantly to our core Manhattan traffic.
Let's talk a little bit about the safety element. This is maybe not as related to congestion pricing, but the sort of the advent of the bike lanes and e-bikes in particular, which are a bit of a sore spot with me anyway, having gotten hit by one and almost hit probably over a dozen times. How does that relate to what's going on here in terms of allocating space within lanes, and then sort of integrating with hopefully fewer cars as congestion pricing thinks about it that way?
Right, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are well traveled, have been to cities where bike lanes work very well. There's nothing the idea of a bike lane is not particularly controversial or difficult. You go to Copenhagen, you go to Paris, you go to Stockholm. Bicyclists have their own space on the street. For the most part, they behave respectfully toward pedestrians. For example, if you ride your bike in Hyde Park around London, it's striking how everybody gets along very well. The bicyclists are not aiming at the pedestrians, or the pedestrians get in their way. The pedestrians are not terrified of the bicyclists sort of plowing by them. It's just a very peaceful atmosphere. And we've now had bike lanes in protected bike lanes in New York City for close to 20 years. They work in one way, the way they're supposed to, in that this has encouraged the growth of bicycle riding. This has taken people off what was an overstrained transit system around 2019. It worked well during the pandemic, and that a lot of people who were fearful of going on mass transit began to ride City Bike as they went back to their day-to-day routines. I mean, City Bike was, our municipal bike share system. That was the first form of organized transit to recover its pre-COVID levels. It did so very, very quickly. I mean, we had, more than six-figure rides a day most days. So it works from one perspective. The other perspective is we have allowed the bike lanes to be taken over by motorized vehicles. An e-bike is a motorized vehicle. People get caught up in this word e. It's not a battery, it is powering a motor. Motorized vehicles should be treated very differently than pedal bikes, and they're not. The city and state should be requiring registration, some level of driver training. It doesn't have to be you go to the DMV and get a license, but something like a 2-day class showing that you understand the rules of the world and driving a motor vehicle, or the rules of the road. And for commercial e-bikes, because most of these are delivery vehicles, the app or the restaurant chain should be carrying fleet insurance. I mean, there is no commercial fleet on the streets of New York. It doesn't have some kind of fleet insurance. So, this is yet another example of sort of letting the tech industry take over our lives, and it's actually pushing pedal bicyclists out of the bike lane. So just like Uber and Lyft, 15 years ago, the city is failing to regulate these e-delivery apps properly, and this is harming what we are trying to do with the streets.
A quick notion on revenue. It's probably pretty early to tell whether this is doing what it wants to do in terms of raising money for the MTA. And I know, for me anyway, sort of occasionally get caught up in the idea, do I need another tax in my life to go up and down? And, does this limit my mobility? What are the thoughts as far as, the revenue generation? And then more specifically, I've never really known a politician who doesn't like an automatic tax. And, if you start getting used to it, they can expand it either by border or by increasing rates, et cetera. How do you think about that in terms of the medium and long-term success of this program?
Right. So the argument for congestion pricing was it will be transformative for the MTA. And this argument was taken from other cities like London, where they implemented congestion pricing. I mean, this goes back 22 years ago now. This provided a huge new revenue stream, and the London Transport for London could use that revenue to do things like massively expand bus service. People would see a real change in their day-to-day commute. In New York City, the congestion pricing charge is just one of close to a dozen tax or free fee revenue streams for the MTA. So, MTA has about $20 billion annual operating budget. About 40% of that comes from dedicated taxes or dedicated fees. So the congestion pricing it's supposed to be $1 billion a year. Many of the MTA's individual tax streams already exceed or rival that. They have a little downstate tax on payrolls in the New York region that brings in $2 billion a year. They've got a little piece of the petroleum tax, sales tax. If you purchase any good in New York City, 0.25% of that goes to the MTA. A tax on franchise tax on your telephone bill. So this isn't a transformative revenue. It is just yet another revenue, because even though all their existing tax revenues keep up with inflation, they were designed to keep up with inflation so that the MTA wouldn't bother the state legislature again once these taxes were enacted. The MTA's costs far exceed inflation growth every year. So every 5 years, they have to go back to the legislature, ask for another tax. They're doing it again this year. So as Trump has his eyes on congestion pricing, wants to get rid of the program, the state is in a difficult position of going back into the people and saying, okay, we said congestion pricing would fix the MTA, but now we need extra billions of dollars a year from you to fund the MTA. So unless you get some handle on the MTA's costs, very hard for the public to support yet more tax revenues for the MTA.
From a functional perspective, do you expect the borders to expand beyond the 60th Street, maybe going out to Brooklyn or Queens or places like that?
I think the first thing that will happen is that the amount of the fee goes up. So right now it's at $9, supposed to start at $15. The governor cut that significantly, partly because people were upset about $15, but it's already scheduled to go up to $15 over the next 5 years until 2030. So it'll gradually increase. That I expect to happen. Eventually, could we go to some kind of vehicle miles travel tax? So it wouldn't be just a blunt tax to enter core Manhattan. It would be more on the miles you travel within the zone. And also, you could do that with other congested areas, downtown Brooklyn, Jamaica, Queens. Once you get into a place where the traffic slows, say below 12 miles an hour, should you be charged for just the space that you're taking up on the street? That's something that could make sense, although also very politically difficult for a number of reasons. But expanding the actual zone, I don't think will happen because in London showed when you do that, you create other problems. For example, if you're living on the Upper East Side right now, you have to pay to drive to the congestion zone. But if that is part of the zone, you would encourage people to just drive within that zone. So that might not be a very good idea.
Right. As we go back to London for a second, is that considered a success? It's had 22 years of operation. When I went there in November, I was running around, the middle of London and all that, and traffic seemed awful to me. So I don't know if congestion was the goal, it didn't work, at least to my small data point.
mean, it's considered a success and that it raises money, although it raises only about $400 million a year, so far less than we want to raise from our program. It's a blunter program and that it's only a daytime program. I think it's like 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and noon to 6 on the weekends. New York's program charges people overnight when there's no congestion, obviously, overnight. So, a big goal of ours is to raise money. The issue with London is that it worked in the first few years. Traffic was down significantly. But after that, just like here, at first they weren't charging the Ubers to come into the zone. They changed that eventually, but you had a problem with the Ubers and Lyfts. You had London redesigning the roads for bike lanes and bus lanes, in some pedestrianized areas. That whole area in front of Somerset House is pedestrianized now, which I think is good. They've widened the sidewalks on Regent Street, so you have a lot more room to walk. They pedestrianized a lot of New Bond Street, so you can walk up and down more easily there. So taking away road space eventually meant you kind of went back to the normal levels of congestion that you had had. So I think that telling people they're going to drive quickly through an urban area is not a good idea. They are never going to, nor should they, drive quickly through an urban area. So there is some sort of sense of false advertising in congestion pricing.
It reminds me of something that I just read today, that the Department of Transportation is slowing down traffic lights on Third Avenue, ostensibly for safety reasons. But then all of a sudden people are saying, geez, is that at odds with one of the stated goals of congestion pricing, which is what you described as that quicker commute or quicker trip?
Right. That's why I actually prefer some of the non-pedestrianized narrow streets in Europe. Like, there's an area of Hamburg where you can drive on these streets, but they're very narrow. And, somebody's going to be walking in front of you. Someone's going to be riding a bike in front of you. A lady's going to have baby carriage crossing the street in front of you. So the price you pay for driving is, you're just going to pick your way down that street going less than 10 miles an hour because the street was not built for you in your car. I think, and the same thing like at Covent Garden in London, you can drive down those streets, but it's not very convenient or fast to drive. I think sending that signal through the design of the roads is a good idea. We're sending very mixed signals. You still have 8th and 9th Avenue that are 4 and 5 and 6 lanes wide, even with the bike lanes. That shows people this is a road you should be driving quickly down, when the whole point of a dense urban area is you're not supposed to be driving through it very quickly.
What would your wish list be for an initiative to tackle New York a little bit? We've got what we've got with congestion pricing. So what would be the next thing you would latch on to here?
I think first we have to deal with the e-bikes, and all of my, bike advocate people will say, well, that's really not the biggest problem. Well, it may not be, but if people are thinking about e-bikes and they are tired of having e-bikes go every which way on the sidewalks, that is a reasonable concern, and you can't do very much else until you've dealt with the e-bikes. So we have to find a way to govern the e-bikes. I think second, we need far more speed and red light cameras. 8th Avenue and 57th Street, since the pandemic, the drivers have gotten used to just blowing through that red light. You used to not have 3 and 4 cars go through the full red light at the change of the light cycle. So there should be zero tolerance for blowing the red light. After you've racked up some of these tickets, you should lose the right to drive your vehicle. So much better enforcement on the speed and the red light side. And I think we should continue to build out the transit system. The project that the governor supports, the train link between Queens and Brooklyn, that is certainly a good idea. Queens Link, the train link to reactivate the old LIRR tracks in Eastern Queens, that is a good idea. We cannot hide behind the fact that we build these projects, way over schedule and over budget, not to build them. We should just do a much better job with the budget and the schedule, because the city is not going to continue to grow unless we continue to grow the transit network.
Really good stuff. Nicole, thank you very much for being on. How do we keep track of you, and how do listeners, viewers get to your book?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Fraser. So, my book again is Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car. And even if you hate bikes, hate pedestrians, you love to drive your car, that's great. And you should read my book just to learn why all of these annoying things are now in your way. The best. If you want to sort of change these things, the best way to do it is to learn how they came into being. So, no matter what side you are, the book is for you. And you can buy it at any physical or online bookstore. And I'm at the Manhattan Institute, just searching for Nicole Gelinas at the Manhattan Institute will generally find my writings on other issues.
You also have a great Twitter account, and I will make sure that's in the show notes too.
Thank you. Constantly trying to quit X, but the problem is it's very useful. So it's hard to get away from it.
Thanks again.